Hi, I'm Patrick Phelps, welcome to Mining Matters. I'm sitting on a piece of public conservation land in the Mikonui Valley on the west coast, not too far south of the metropolis of Ross. About 2 years ago, Newsroom reporter Farrah Hancock wrote a series of stories claiming that gold mining on this very spot left behind a desolate wasteland or moonscape. These articles claimed that the miner, NZG Limited, had broken the rehabilitation conditions initially agreed upon with the Department of Conservation. Coverage in other media, such as a repeat of the story on Stuff and then subsequent interviews on RNZ, reinforced this narrative. The problem with a lot of this coverage is that it was, or at least seems, wrong. The initial article on Newsroom largely reflected the views of West Coast Conservation Board member and photographer Neil Silverwood, and to a lesser extent Nikki Snoyink, employee of lobby group Forest and Bird. Subsequent articles continued in the same vein, but these articles don't necessarily match up with Doc's version of things. You see, shortly after that first article in June 2020, an internal memo circulated within Doc calling the media coverage inaccurate and stating that the mine closure rehabilitation achieved by NZG Limited was significantly more positive than portrayed. It's worth pointing out that when all this blew up, the Conservation Minister was Green Party politician and Distinguished Life Member of Forest and Bird, Eugenie Sage. As for the articles themselves, the footage and photographs of this site give the misleading impression that the mining that NZG carried out from about 2016-17 onwards destroyed old growth native forest, like you can see in the background there. But actually Doc's memo explains that most of this site was mined in the 1990s. My guess is that most of it was a mix of gorse, tutu and wineberry. The memo does note that about 0.34 hectares of kamahi trees that had grown since mining was carried out 60 years ago was the oldest patch of forest affected by NZG's mining operations. As Doc's memo notes, most alluvial gold mines on the west coast tend to be on previously mined ground in areas with regenerating rather than old growth forest. Higher gold prices and improved technology make it economic for miners to go over old ground, chasing gold that previous miners may have missed. Neil Silverwood also claimed that the pit that NZG left behind was in breach of agreement with Doc, that no topsoil had been spread, and that replanting that had been agreed to hadn't been carried out. Let's start with the hole. So going off the memo, as well as another bit of correspondence that I'll get to shortly, it does sound like there was a bit of a mix-up. When NZG initially got access to this site, it was in agreement with Doc that they would use materials from this site to fill in a pit on a neighbouring site that had been left behind by another company, McKay's Mining. I'm not sure entirely what had happened, but basically McKay's Mining thought that they could leave it behind and they couldn't, so when NZG got access to this site, it was on the basis that they would fill in McKay Mining's hole. Anyway, filling in that site reduced the materials that were available to fill in the pit on this site. Then also NZG applied for access to a neighbouring block of public conservation land, Bowen's Terrace. As I understand it, the intention had been to use materials from Bowen's Terrace to fill in this pit, and I guess they would have just smoothed everything across all sites. I don't know. According to documents written by the Department of Conservation, Bowen's Terrace contained high-value conservation land with lowland kahikatea forest. Doc advised NZG of this and also explained that any application for access was unlikely to be successful and would be a publicly notified process. 2 years passed, and by about mid-2019 NZG withdrew its application for Bowen's Terrace and set to work rehabilitating this site. Doc's memo outlines that the combined Doc and West Coast Regional Council bond for rehabilitation of the site was about $180,000, but the final amount spent on rehabilitation of the site by NZG Limited was between $220,000 and $250,000. What the memo says is that the mine pit was reduced but not entirely filled because, given the limited overburden and materials on site, this provided a better overall landform result. Doc's memo states a complete coverage of soils was achieved by materials being carted in from a mine on private farmland downstream, mixed with mine fines and gravels. This established an upper surface growing medium, and the first stage of succession with gorse was underway at the time this memo was written in mid-2020. And you can sort of see how it's going, looking north, south, east and west. Finally, the planting. The reason that no planting was done is that based on Doc's previous experience at similar sites, you know, small alluvial gold mines on previously disturbed ground that are surrounded by mature or established forest, planting has proven to be more expensive and less effective than regeneration through gorse. Effectively, gorse takes hold, stabilises soil, shelters the land from erosion, provides shelter for native trees which grow up in the shade, and then eventually those natives overtake the gorse and the gorse dies off. with the seeds having obviously been distributed by birds from nearby forest, much like what's happened on Hinawai Reserve out at Banks Peninsula, if you're familiar with that. Doc's memo noted that native woody vegetation would become established about 10 to 15 years on and would overtake the gorse after about the 20-25 year mark, and the site would be much as it was before NZG has started mining about 2016. Insofar as Newsroom mentioned any of the above context, and one of its co-editors, Tim Murphy, argues that it did, I think that a lot of that context was glossed over, and the overall vibe of the articles, if you like, was misleading. The articles certainly caused other people to have concerns about this site's restoration. For example, two others who sat on the West Coast Conservation Board alongside Neil Silverwood were the former chairperson of the board, Keith Morfitt, and one of its other members, Inga Perkins. They wrote a letter to some of DOC's senior staff, up to and including the then Director General, Lou Sanson, expressing their concerns with the site's rehabilitation. DOC's manager on the West Coast, Mark Davies, got the pleasure of responding to Keith and Inga's letter and clarified much of what I have outlined in the course of this video. The tone of the letter differs from the tone of the memo, with Mark saying that the restoration wasn't perfect, but given the context outlined, he was comfortable that the rehabilitation achieved was an acceptable result. Not fully satisfied with Mark's 5-page explanation, Inga Perkins, who was now the acting chair of the Conservation Board, given that Keith Morfitt had moved on, sent another letter to Mark saying that, among other things, it might be best if DOC got advice from outside experts. This time, Mark just sent a 1-page reply. He said that he was confident in his staff's decisions, that intervening in succession through gorse would have a high cost for low benefit, that such investment wouldn't be justified because it wouldn't change the biodiversity outcome, and that the site is not a high priority for nature conservation. And that's the end of that paper trail. Now, from all of this, I can only draw a few conclusions. Either all of the concerns that have been raised about the restoration of this mine site are legitimate, or they're not. If you accept that the complaints are valid and legitimate, you have to accept that DOC staff up to and including the Director General didn't know about what happened or just didn't care. You then have to accept that neither Lou Sanson nor any other staff within DOC nor anyone else outside of it saw fit to tell Eugenie Sage, who was Conservation Minister for 4 months from when the first story broke up to the election that was held the same year. I think the more likely explanation is something like this. Neil Silverwood, Nikki Snoyink and a few of the other people that I mentioned made some public claims about this site and didn't have quite the same regard or place quite the same value on accuracy or honesty as, well, I personally would normally do when making public statements. Now, the reason that they may have done this, I assume, is due to their quite public and open opposition to mining on public conservation land. Then Farrah Hancock and others at Newsroom basically ran the articles with about as equal a regard for accuracy and honesty in what they were reporting. Newsroom's co-editor, Tim Murphy, has argued on the publication's website that the coverage given was an accurate version of events. He and others are free to argue that the information I am now sharing is not entirely accurate or honest, but for anyone who really gives a shit, I've included links below to all of the media coverage that's taken place up to date and all of the documentation that I've referenced in this video, and yeah, like I say, if you really give a shit, you can take a look and figure out for yourself what you make of it all. But anyway, thanks for watching.